groups like TEP, the Tibetan Equality Project, are doing such transformative work around creating language and platforms for queer Tibetans. And their visions, I think, are really profound, and they're the ones that are going to propel us into a new bhoepa future.
Hi, everyone. This is the 5th episode of Positionality Podcast. This is the second episode of Identity Sequence. The last guest was Tenzin Within, who is just an incredible leader and has so much to offer for the Tibetan community. If you have not checked it out already, please check it out. It's on our YouTube account and it's also on Instagram. So in today's episode, we have another young leader, Chinzom. I met Chinzom at a Tibetan Youth Leadership Program in DC a couple years back. It was hosted by International Campaign for Tibet. We were both in undergrad at that time. However, we spent a week together with 8 other participants. So during that time, I got to know Chinzom and we spent time together. Chinzom was always very outspoken about who she was and as a Tibetan Indian, and you can just tell that she really embraced who she is and just was really proud of it. So I invited Chinzom to be our guest because I think she's just an incredible soul that people really need to get to know. A little bit about Chinzom. She was born and raised in traditional Chinook territory, now known as Portland, Oregon. She is a recent college graduate. Chinzom spent the past several years as a community organizer in Southeast Michigan, where she worked on issues including indigenous sovereignty, racial justice, and housing justice. As a Tibetan Indian American, she is invested in building features that hold space for spirits and lineages of all indigenous people and moves with intention ancestors who have crossed mountains and oceans. Wow. Welcome, Chinzom. Just your bio says so much about you, and I feel incredibly lucky to have met you, but also to share this space with you today. So before we start, Chinzom would like to start with a little prayer. So go on ahead, Chinzom.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here, and it's so lovely to share this space with you. My name is Priya Chinzom, and I use she, her pronouns. And I just wanted to start with this prayer before we dive into our conversation in acknowledgement of Indigenous Peoples Day, which was this past Monday on October 12th. And this prayer is one that I continually return to. It was written and presented by a Black Latinx community leader named Bronte Velez, who works with an organization called Lead to Life that's based out of traditional Ohlone territories in what is now known as Oakland, California. And this prayer is usually given during gatherings to set intentions before spaces are commenced. Thank you, Great Spirit, for the soil, mountains, trees, water, and air. May we honor these elements as the ingredients of our alchemy. May we be in right relationship to these gifts. May we celebrate your abundance, never take more than we need, and give ourselves back to you as a gift. We honor the ancestors of these lands and the original peoples still here, and ask for your permission in the lands before all else to carry out our work in peace and for peace. May humility step first so as to let grace walk us down the path. May we decompose violence in ourselves before we ask it of the world. May we learn from the mushrooms what it means to carry death into new life. May we remember freedom is a practice, not a destination, one that we must practice every day. May we always be imaginative in the face of violence. May we be willing to reimagine what it means to be secure. May we liberate the sacred trapped inside of all weapons, remembering that the gun has a source. May we too surrender to source. May we be diligent and discerning in our work until our lands, communities, and minds are liberated from the talons of greed, hatred, and delusion. And still, may we decolonize our sense of urgency, productivity, right and wrong, and call in the muse that knows this will take time, that knows we cannot solve a problem with the same mind that made it, that knows beauty is not an arrival but the way. Listening to our dreams, we remember that another way is always possible.
Thank you for that, Priya. That's amazing. So you obviously identify as indigenous as a Tibetan. Is that right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. What will you say are the top? I don't know. What will you say are some of the identities that you mostly associate yourself with?
I would say definitely that I am Piba.
Mm,
I'm Tibetan. I am a Tibetan in exile who is also of Indian heritage. And I'm also an indigenous person. And I think it's important that I always remember and name the indigeneity that Pibas carry on their bodies because it is um, an identity and I think a way of existing in the world that roots us in
mm.
place and also connects us to people. And so those are the three that I would say in response.
So did you grew up knowing you were indigenous, or when did you know that you really wanted to be in touch with your indigenous side?
I think there's a struggle in the Pivo community that I've seen around naming ourselves as Indigenous people. But one of the most healing things that I did was connecting with people Indigenous to Turtle Island because I saw how many of their struggles and how much of their brilliance reflects what is happening in our community and our experience as Pibas.
Yeah.
Um, and I would say that growing up, particularly as a mixed Piba, I did not really think of myself as Indigenous because it just wasn't terminology that was, I think, available to me then or articulated to me.
Yeah.
And what I noticed most growing up in Piba communities and around other Pibas was where the margins of our community are. So I had this very strong attunement from a really young age to who is accepted and who is not,
Mm,
and what the markers are for acceptance in our community. And I have a story about this actually that I've kind of excavated from my memory and thought a lot about in recent years. But the first writing that I actually ever published was in a Sunday school writing contest.
mm,
And I wrote about my experience at Tibetan summer camp and about how I had this really pervasive feeling of not being whole
mm.
and feeling like something was missing because I was mixed or because I did not have two Pima parents. And I actually won that writing contest.
Wow. How old were
And I think that I was 11, around 11 or 12 years old. And I saw that, I mean, this feedback was immediate, right? I basically admitted to having this shame
you?
about being mixed. And what I received from the Piba community was this resounding validation and celebration
Mm,
for kind of airing that shame, right? And so um, thinking about it now, I see that growing up in those spaces, I would often get treated differently because I was mixed, but I also carried this card of speaking Pöge, right?
uh-huh.
And language, as all Pibas I'm sure know, is a token of access into spaces that might otherwise shut you out. Um, and so I used that. I used it a lot, and I noticed that people would treat me differently once they knew that I spoke Pöge.
Mhm. So were you more
And
accepted once you were speaking Tibetan?
yes, for sure. And that was something that, though I might have never said it
Mm,
explicitly, I knew that. And so I always carried it with me as something that I could use if I felt that I needed to protect myself, right? Or validate myself to other Pibas. It was that kind of knowledge of Pöge that nobody could take away from me, right? But all that said, I will say that I don't identify very much with the category of mixed puba, which I think has come up a lot. It has proliferated definitely in the past several years as a way to kind of rally around this experience of feeling excluded from the puba community.
right.
But I will say that I don't resonate very much with it because it's not only mixed pibas who know this experience of somehow existing on the margins of the Tibetan community. right? It's all people who have marginalized identities and who fall outside the idea of what a normative phoeba has to be. And the people who I have felt most seen by and seen most are not necessarily mixed phoebas, right? Um, they're people who understand this experience of being on the margins somehow. And I also notice a lot in conversations around mixed Tibetan identity that this category lumps together people who actually experience vastly different amounts of privilege and access in our community spaces based on things like skin color,
Mhm.
anti-blackness, etc. And
Right.
so I think, yeah, the way that I have thought about my Tibetanness has changed a lot, and especially my Tibetan Indianness, right? Because I think that there's kind of this narrative of pride, right? Of being proud of who you are. But
Mm.
for me, that still hinges on being recognized by other people, right? Being validated by other people.
Mhm.
And I don't resonate with that as much as I think I used to growing up because I've seen that there is another way, right? And there's a poet um, who I really love named Claudia Rankine, and she has this quote where she talks about the worst injury is feeling like you don't belong so much to yourself. And so when I read that, I resonated with it so much because I think for me, being a Pibwa who is also of a different heritage
Mhm.
has been less about being proud of myself and more about feeling belonging and feeling safe in my own body. So that's, yeah, that's what I'll say, I think, about that.
When did you realize you can use that Pippa card, or at least speaking Pippa, and that you would feel included? Like, what age did you realize that?
Um, I can't say that there was a moment when I realized it, but I was always surrounded by my pibapingya and like my classmates at Sunday school, right, growing up. And so I learned very quickly, right, that I was not what people expected, right? People don't expect someone like me to be able to speak in a language that they understand, right? They don't expect me to be able to communicate with them in that way. And I recognized that very early on. And I also used it very early on, right, to gain access.
Mhm.
And when I was little, I just thought of it as something that I had to do to protect myself, right? But now, in retrospect, I see that it is a choice, and it's a choice that has a lot of power.
Wow, that's very true. What do you think when people realize that you can speak Tibetan and you can understand Tibetan, like some people have hard time wrapping their head around that. Do you have any idea like why some Tibetans have such a hard time accepting Tibetan or other different looking Tibetans as Tibetan? They only see, I don't know, people who look like Tibetan into the community.
I mean, I think it's partly related to this deep anxiety, right, that all Pibas have about preserving Tibetanness,
I I
right?
agree.
That's something that Pibas feel no matter where they are, whether they're like in Chige or in Gyawa or anywhere in exile or even in Pö. And so I understand this kind of need to create this ideal Piba who is like undeniably connected to their heritage because sometimes the loss, right, the feeling of loss becomes so overwhelming that we need to grab onto something. But I think that that sense it kind of falls away when we see how many new paths Pivas are creating to be Piva, right? And this is not to say that our heritage doesn't matter, where we came from doesn't matter. All of that that came before us built foundations for us to be where we are right now, right? And it's we're in conditions right now that are unprecedented in the history of our community, right? And so the ways that people choose to be pivotal right now are also going to be ways that we might have never seen before. And I think that creating space for that is really important because it's going to be our path into the future.
I definitely agree. I ordered that question really weird, but your answer is on point. I do think there is a huge anxiety with preserving our culture, and if anyone steps outside of that boundary or marries another race, we instantly get this weird feeling or, oh, like what? She's half or her mom's American. But I definitely agree. And I do think we need to moving forward, I do think we need to have a discourse about topics such as this and hold space for, conversations so we can move forward without feeling excluded. So the next question is, you touched a little bit on this, Chinzom, but what was it like growing up as a Tibetan Indian in the US?
I think this is probably related to my experience as a person who grew up in the place that I did, which is I did not grow up as a working class person or in a working class community. And I was largely surrounded by affluent white people growing up.
Mm.
And while I was never really ashamed of being brown, I absolutely benefited from being in proximity to white people. And I was pulled into this sort of myth of white respectability where I thought that I could become successful in this world if I could just convince white people that I could be civil and that I could speak their language as well or even better than they could. But I think that going to university was a really pivotal point in my life because I sort of woke up from this. And I see that because university for me was my initiation into the really, really intimate um, kind of anxiety and spirit of whiteness. I started to really understand the deep spiritual illness that white supremacy is and how knowledge is being produced at some of the most elite levels of society to rationalize it. And this process of coming into awareness is one that once you see or and understand, you can't unsee. And so one of the most formative experiences in my life actually happened in my junior year of college when I was taking a policy course on gun control. And the curriculum that was being taught was extremely violent. I won't go into details, but it essentially used and was re traumatizing the very few students of color in the classroom to prove to white people that racism is real.
Yeah.
And so maybe 3 weeks into the class, I confronted a white student in my class and I received this really severe backlash that in retrospect I should have expected, but that at the time felt unwarranted and really painful to me. It included anonymous hate messages, and it was a form of social excommunication, right? And I, over the course of that semester, had to continue confronting professors and administrators at my school, all of who were pretty resistant. And I even convened a staff and faculty roundtable just to address our school's racist curriculum and pedagogy. And it was one of the most stressful semesters of my undergraduate years. But I can also definitively say that it was the semester that I abandoned any allegiance to whiteness that I had left. And it took me a lot of years of disillusionment to even get to that point because prior to that experience, I'd spent 2 years already organizing in Asian American communities on campus. And throughout my life, I think I had never really felt Asian American. It still isn't a label that I would use to describe myself. Part of that is just that I don't feel affinity with other Asian Americans just by virtue of their being Asian American. And I think this goes back to the fact that um, Asian American itself as a label was created by white people to categorize us, right, in a way that makes sense to them. But it'll never encompass who we are, other than maybe as a political unit in diaspora. Um, and besides that, I'd never even experienced a lot of these kind of classic Asian American experiences like lunchbox moments, for example, right? Or that kind of shame about being Asian American. The shame that I felt was very particular. It didn't have to do with me being Asian American. It had to do with the conditions of my being bhoepa, of being in exile, of being indigenous, right? And so I spent 2 years organizing in Asian American communities, but I ended up leaving at the end of my second year in university just for the sake of my own well-being because I had kind of had enough. I spent those 2 years really trying to push my peers. Um, and when I look back, I know that it was because I wanted to be recognized, right? I wanted people desperately to see me and recognize me as part of that community and as valid of an Asian American as they were. But there was this comfortable line in those spaces that was never crossed because once they did, they would have to acknowledge, right, the dynamics of colonialism, of Chinese nationalism, of East Asian and light skin and upper class
Right.
elitism that underpinned all of these spaces, right? And that's a slippery slope. So I left. I ended up leaving those spaces. And ironically, it was that decision that actually brought me closer to my own Hiba self, because I began thinking really hard about place and about belonging and my responsibilities. And it was around that time also that I kind of began exercising the muscles of my imagination, and also came into a chosen family. And so I see that as a really valuable um, and formative time in my life, especially around thinking about what it meant to be a Piba in the way that I was.
Mm-hmm. It seemed like a very tough but awakening moment for you when you took time off from school.
Definitely.
I think a lot of institutions are just so racist, and when you finally start realizing that your comfortable level just is not there anymore, it's everything is just really because like I went to a school, St. Lawrence University, and I
Mhm.
really loved it there. When I first visited there, it was amazing. Everyone was super nice. And then I realized all the funds were going into clubs that were mostly white people. And when any of the student union or the African student union, Asian student, Asian club, La Sociedad, when they try to get money, it's always a backlash, and it was always really hard to allocate money from them. Just institutions can be so racist, and it can really take a toll on your mental health. But so you touched a little bit about your socioeconomic, and I won't go in that. But how has your gender influenced your everyday life in the US?
Oh, that's such a big question. I would say that more than just an identity category, I think that what women have to learn, whether they're Pivo or not, is about survival, right? What we learn as women is a common language of survival. And I think, especially in the past several years, being a survivor made me really understand patriarchy through gender based violence. And it made me understand gendered violence, particularly as an ongoing reality and a force that is also propelling us towards futures, right? That are both trauma informed and that are decarceral, that don't hold space for any kind of prison system or bondage of
Mhm,
people. And I think it's also important to note here that I try to be very intentional about noting that I'm a cisgender woman.
mhm,
For people who might not have heard that term, cisgender basically means that the sex that I was assigned at birth and the gender identity that I associate myself with correspond. So I identify as a cis woman, and this is important for me to say, I think, because cis women and women are not the only ones that experience gender based violence, right? We know that queer, trans, and gender nonconforming people also experience extreme violence for existing as they are, right? And actually, a friend of mine who reflects and writes on queer Piva issues said this kind of comment that was really profound to me that I think about a lot. And he basically said that in a world where everything that we think about in terms of gender and sexuality is confined by binaries, right? One or the other, right? Male, like male or female. People are often asking this question of who is included in this space and who isn't in this space, right? That's a way that we try to bring people on the margins into our spaces, right? It's like a common terminology and kind of question that's posed in a lot of spaces that are social justice oriented. But those questions actually avoid the bigger question of what is this space even for, right? What is the purpose of this space? And we know that the answer is always safety, right? Women created spaces for other women so that they could feel safe from harm, and it's the same with queer spaces and any spaces that marginalized people build for each other. So if we're thinking about gendered violence and who is really harmed by it, we also have to be thinking about who experiences the violence of patriarchy and of queer phobia and transphobia, et cetera, because it's not only women and it's not only cis women.
mhm.
And I really, really, truly believe that the queer pibas in our community are among our revolutionaries. because groups like TEP, the Tibetan Equality Project, are doing such transformative work
Mhm.
around creating language and platforms for queer Tibetans. And their visions, I think, are really profound, and they're the ones that are going to propel us into a new Puba future.
So, what are some of the ways do you think in our community, especially in America, Tibetans, how can we hold space for them and elevate them? And what can we do? What can we do in your thoughts?
Mhm. I think, well, I mean, I also speak from my position as an ally and accomplice. I'm not like a queer identifying person. And so I can only speak from my experience learning and struggling. And for me, it's always about taking initiative to learn for myself and seeking out resources that I know are out there, right? Because queer people have been visioning and writing about their experiences and their needs and their demands for, I mean, for now for centuries, right? And it's really our imperative, I think, and it's our choice to engage with that. And to me, I mean, it doesn't feel as much like a choice as it does a responsibility. And so, I think for me, engaging with what queer peoples are doing and being willing to listen without feeling the need to defend, I think, is really important. And also taking initiative to educate each other, right? Before bringing queer pibas into spaces that we don't know will be safe. I think it's so important that everybody in that space have common expectations and norms and kind of consensus around what a safe space looks like, especially for spaces that are not known historically to have queer voices platformed. So that's just what I would say personally.
Mm. I agree with that. I am not an expert in this topic, but I would say having conversations and continue to seek out informations and educate yourself would be something that we can all do. And I also think it's not just a to-do list. I also think it's our responsibility and something that we all need to be aware to know that we should hold space for queer LGBTQs for our Tibetan communities. So, Priya, as an Asian America or Asian in America, I know you said you don't like to be identified as Asian American. As an Asian or Tibetan in America, what privilege have you noticed that you have that other people don't?
Mhm. Yeah, I did talk a little bit earlier about how I feel about this label of Asian American, right, and how I don't really identify with it. But what I will say is that as a person who is a settler and also non-Black,
Mhm.
I benefit immensely from the privileges that these statuses give me, right? I've never experienced what it is to be Black or Indigenous to Turtle Island, and that in and of itself is important
Mhm.
because I am not standing or building a life or doing healing work on land that was built on my back. For
Mhm.
me, thinking about Peu is never separate from these two facts because as much rage and I think sadness as I felt about our Piva histories and realities, I see that same rage and sadness and also brilliance reflected in this land and its people. And I see that what we have experienced as Pibas for 4 generations stretches back countless generations here, right? It's pain that lives in people's blood and bodies. And I mean, these days, scientifically, right, we know that because of fields like epigenetics, that trauma is actually passed down in our DNA. And so, if we think about how we as eggs were actually formed while our mothers were still in our grandmother's stomachs, we
Mhm.
know the stresses that our grandmother's bodies experienced because our bodies were formed under those conditions. And so, when I see the realities of Black folks, of Indigenous folks here, um, many of whom, I mean, in the case of Black folks who don't know the name of their Paiute, right, or First Nations people who have been like brilliantly traversing the like machinery of colonialism many more generations than Pibas have. I see us and I see our Bingya and our relatives. And for me, that feels like a really important reality to acknowledge and also to live from.
So those were some really great answers, and I'm really happy that you're here. I learned a lot. Um, just for let's get some light questions. What kind of hobbies, activities do you have, and how has all of those interests been affected by your environment, your surroundings?
hmm So as a person in exile, I think for me, my conscience, and I'm sure the conscience of all Pivas in exile, is always rooted in return.
Mm.
Since physically returning isn't always possible, I have to find ways to practice return and reconcile that distance in the everyday, right? And so for me, hobbies are a way to feel connected. So something that I started recently during quarantine actually is sewing. I decided to teach myself how to sew, even though I've always convinced myself that I'm not a person who is very capable with my hands. And our lineage is actually full of really strong women who are good with their heads and their hands. And so I was like, if all of my ancestors did this, it is probably like in my capacity to do this. And so that's something that I've been doing recently. I also really love to read.
Mhm.
Reading is really important to me, not so much even as like a hobby, but just like as a life project, because it was a way for me to open up worlds that I could not see in my um, every day. And when I engage with stories of place, no matter where that place is or where people are writing from, I can feel love for land. And so reading for me is a practice that reminds me how many ways there are to be familiar with my own Payu Nakchu, despite my not being able to know so much else about that place, right? So reading, I really think, opens up worlds. I can think of one more. I really love to move. I don't really like the terminology of like working out or exercising very much because it feels more discipline and punishment oriented than celebration oriented. And so for me, thinking about movement, I think is a celebration, right? And it's about respect because my body, for me, is my most steadfast supporter. And it took me a admittedly short lifetime to learn this, but I know that I'm most well when I can recognize and treat myself non-violently. And so movement for me is a really big part of like being intuitive and kind of like stepping into that.
Yeah. What a great way to look at or revisioning, reimagining or revisioning, rewarding your hobbies and movements. I also just want to acknowledge that the reason why I asked for your hobbies and activities, I think it is such a privilege for us to be able to have these stuff. And even for me, this is my hobby. I do this podcast to get to know people. I know I have the privilege to be able to have these kind of conversations with you. Um, and I just want to say that when we were young, or when I was young, and when I first moved to the U.S., I was really into drawing, and I was really into singing and dancing and acting. And but there was always this kind of guilt that I was holding from going from TCV Gobabur and being told that when we're older, we need to be doctors, nurses, teachers in order to kind of save Tibetans because we were the future leaders, right? And I felt really guilty to be able to have these kind of hobbies. And I think part of me did give it up just a little bit. When I was around seventh grade or eighth grade, I just focused on school because that's what I thought we should do. We should, you know, do well in school, get a good job, and then help Tibet.
This is a conversation that I actually
Mhm.
have with my family a lot, my somlas and my amla even around our responsibilities
Mhm.
as the younger generation. And I know that for her, my amla and my aunts, right, their priority was survival, right? Which is not to say surviving is any easier under like state terror in the United States, but it is to say that the thing that was on their minds was always assimilation, right? From Ga, where they were trying to assimilate into Indian society, and then like crossing an entire ocean and
Mhm.
trying to rebuild an entire life here. That is a life project, right? That takes an entire lifetime to do.
Mhm.
And in their case, the way that they tried to survive, the conditions that they were surviving under are different from the conditions that we're trying to survive under, right? And so for me, whereas my parents, their responsibilities felt like surviving and trying to create a foundation for a life here, an indefinite life here, right? We don't know how long we're going to be here. Um, for me, it feels like doing the work of healing at my parents' generation and my grandparents and great grandparents' generation was not able to do. And so for me, things like self care, community care, all of these skills that we learn to be in tune with our bodies and the world around us, that feels like my responsibility, right? And so that's something that I try to always live from and always try to affirm myself in, because the world, right, is trying to do everything to keep you from being in tune with what your body is telling you, right? And so it's also a process of trying to learn to self affirm when that affirmation is not going to be coming from anywhere else.
Right. That was the word I was looking for. Our parents, they were on survival mode, and growing up, my dad would always tell me how he crossed the mountains and how he had to live in India by himself and make a life for us. So I think that burden, it kind of carried over me, and I felt guilty in doing certain stuffs that would make me happy. But it's always like being able to attend school is a privilege, and we always have talks as an RA. They always talk about self-care, and I'm working through these guilt and saying, okay, I'm here, I can take care of myself because that is important, and not always feel that, you know, my parent was on survival mode. They have such they did so much, and I should feel the same way. No, I really think that we need to take care of ourselves first here if you're able to. Um, but that's that, yeah. Thanks, Priya. That was amazing summary of what I was trying to say. You worded perfectly as always. So those were the last questions I had. But do you have any last message that you wanna give to our viewers?
Oh my gosh. I think everyone is kind of feeling a lot of uncertainty right now in this moment that we're all in. And it's really important that people take this time, I think, to feel in tune with themselves and to be honest with themselves. And I think that it takes a lot of emotional, I think, practice to be able to do that. But I think it is really important for us to be able to communicate with ourselves honestly about what we're experiencing. Because if we can't do that, right, then it's so hard to create communities that are healthy. And so, what I would say to anyone who is listening right now is to be gentle with yourself and also to not be judgmental with yourself, to not feel shame or guilt, as easy as that is to say,
Right.
with whatever is coming up for you right now. And also to reflect the energy that you send towards other people, all that energy of goodwill, to also leave some for yourself.
Well, that is a great last minute words. I really think it's important that we talk friendly to ourselves and kind, because we often don't do that. We always I do this all the time. I always think the best of everyone, and when it comes to me, if I do the same thing, I'll just think of the worst.
Mhm.
So that's a really great
Yeah.
word.
It's hard, right? Because I mean, if we can't treat ourselves well, then how are we able to treat other people well, right? And so yeah, that is. I'll just wrap it up there, or else I might go on a tangent.
And now it's such high anxiety. Everyone, there's so much things going. So I really hope anyone who's listening to keep going and be gentle to yourself. So with that said, thank you, Priya. Lovely to have you here. You made some really amazing points, and it was just really great.
Thank you so much for having me. It was so lovely to share this space with you and catch up.